Evolutions are some of the most fascinating turning points in history, where a series of events causes massive changes in the status quo. Among them, the Bolshevik October Revolution of 1917 stands out as one of the most radical and transformative, overshadowing even the American, French, Haitian, and Iranian revolutions. It was a cascade of events in a backwater country that spiraled into one of the most dramatic, violent, and complex times, deeply impacting every human being in the 20th century. At the root of it all were two figures: Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and Vladimir Lenin. These two men were hardcore idealists, with one clinging to the old world and the other aiming to burn it down and create a new one. Nicholas II was detached from reality, failing to understand the state of his massive empire, while Lenin, a master manipulator, swayed millions of people with his speeches and writings. Their ignorance and manipulation led to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history and paved the way for the rise of one of the most oppressive regimes the world had ever seen. Imagine a world where misinformation and ignorance are allowed to flourish, where people are manipulated into violent revolutions. Today, thankfully, we have a tool that combats both: Ground News. Their platform provides a panoramic view of how news is covered across the world in real time, showing you the political leanings of articles, their sources, and even the financial backers behind the news organizations. It helps you understand the biases and perspectives that shape the news you consume, enabling you to make better-informed decisions. You can try it out at ground.news/alternate, and by subscribing using the QR code, you can get 40% off unlimited access, giving you all the insights for less than your daily coffee. Now let's go back to Russia in 1917. What if Lenin had never made it back to Russia? What if the revolution never took place? Let's take a step back and look at the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. He was often paranoid and anti-reformist, shaped by the traumatic experience of his grandfather Alexander II being assassinated. His reign began with tragedy. 1,300 people died during his coronation ceremony in a stampede, marking the first of many disastrous decisions. He led a country that was centuries behind the rest of the world, struggling to industrialize and modernize its massive railroads. In 1904, Russia faced a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, resulting in strikes, famine, and unrest. This culminated in Bloody Sunday, when peaceful protesters marching to the Winter Palace were gunned down by royal guards. This led to the Revolution of 1905, which forced Nicholas to make some reforms, such as granting religious freedom and creating the Duma, a form of parliament. However, these promises were short-lived. Nicholas reneged on his commitments, using military force to suppress dissent and exile thousands to Siberia. Meanwhile, radical socialist ideas began to take root among the peasants and workers. Despite the turmoil, Nicholas's primary concern was his family, especially his son, who suffered from hemophilia. The Tsar's focus on succession, rather than the country's issues, led to a failure to address the country's underlying problems. By 1914, Russia was plunged into World War I, and the country's military weaknesses were exposed. After a disastrous campaign, Nicholas assumed command of the army, but his absence from the capital left it vulnerable. The Duma seized the opportunity and forced Nicholas to abdicate, replacing the monarchy with a provisional government. This was the February Revolution of 1917, which promised to transform Russia into a constitutional democracy, granting civil liberties and freedom of speech. However, the new government was fractured, with competing factions vying for control. And in the midst of all this chaos, a wild card appeared: Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled in Switzerland. The Germans saw an opportunity to weaken their enemy and facilitated Lenin's return to Russia, providing him with the means to spread his Marxist ideas. Upon his return, Lenin wrote the April Theses, which instructed Soviet workers to overthrow the provisional government and take power for themselves. Lenin's vision was radical, and he was unwavering in his determination to make it a reality. The result was the October Revolution of 1917, which would change the course of history forever. But what if Lenin never returned to Russia? What if the revolution had never taken place? In this alternate timeline, the provisional government, though fractured and struggling to hold on, might have been able to consolidate power and stabilize Russia. The country could have pursued a more peaceful path, avoiding the catastrophic civil war that followed. However, without Lenin's leadership, the radical push for socialism might have been replaced by more moderate reforms, preventing the rise of the Soviet Union. But even without Lenin's influence, the pressure of World War I and the internal unrest would have kept Russia on a volatile path. The military, suffering from low morale, might have eventually staged a coup of its own. In this timeline, the Bolsheviks might have still played a role, but they would have had to compromise with other factions, possibly even joining the provisional government rather than overthrowing it. Without the violent Bolshevik Revolution, Russia's future could have been radically different. Perhaps the country would have undergone gradual reforms, slowly modernizing its economy and political system without the brutal and oppressive methods of the Soviet regime. Yet, as history shows us, revolution often arises in times of crisis, and Russia's turmoil in 1917 was no exception. In this alternate timeline, the Russian Civil War might not have erupted, or it might have taken on a different form. The whites, who sought to restore the monarchy or install a military dictatorship, would still face resistance, but the lack of a strong Bolshevik force would weaken their opposition. The Allies, fearing the spread of communism, would likely support the whites, but without the driving force of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the conflict would be less intense. In this version of history, Russia might have avoided the rise of Stalin and the purges that followed. The Soviet Union, as we know it, might never have existed. The global impact of the Bolshevik Revolution would have been far less pronounced, and the 20th century might have unfolded in a radically different way. But history is shaped by the choices of individuals, and the course of events often hinges on a single moment. In our timeline, Lenin's return to Russia was that moment. Without him, the future of Russia and the world would have been forever changed. Well, that's it for now. If you're curious to learn more about pivotal moments in history, subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories.